In 1994, I published a book called Raising Children in a Socially Toxic Environment. The idea was that just as in the physical environment, where there can be poisons in the air, in the water, in the ground, poisons that affect human development, human growth, so in the social environment there could be poisons, cultural, social poisons which undermine healthy and normal development. The other side of this was just as in the physical environment where individuals vary in their vulnerability to these poisons, that could be true as far as social toxicity as well. So for example, in the physical environment, if there's an outbreak of air pollution in your city, you particularly worry about individuals whose breathing is compromised, people with emphysema, children with asthma. The same thing, I think, was true of social toxicity, that individuals would vary in their vulnerability. Some kids, for example, might be so vulnerable to these social toxins that you might consider them sort of psychosocial asthmatics. Let me give you an example. I visited a school for emotionally disturbed kids back in Chicago at one point, and the director said that they had run the same program for 20 years. The only change was it used to work and it didn't. It appeared that what happened was these vulnerable children were importing into the school a level of aggression and hostility and disorganization the program wasn't set up to deal with. It really was as if they were psychosocial asthmatics living in a more socially toxic environment. So that was the basic concept. In 1996, Patricia Falk, a legal scholar, published an article in the North Carolina Law Review in which she took this concept of social toxicity and began to explore how it figured into what she called novel theories of criminal defense. Coincidentally, that was the same time I was beginning to work as a psychological expert witness in murder cases, and over the last 20 years developed this idea of social toxicity as an element in understanding the context in which vulnerable individuals are growing, developing, and in many cases embarking on a path of criminality. All of this derives from where I come from is called an ecological perspective on human development. The recognition that rarely does human development and behavior occur universally, uniformly, homogeneously across context. So much so that actually if you ask the question, does X cause Y, the best scientific answer is almost always it depends. It depends on the context in which this phenomenon is taking place. And social toxicity became a way to describe, to evaluate, to understand the role of context in development, particularly with respect to criminality. For example, a study done 30 years ago asked the question, are children born with minor neurological impairment at greater risk for becoming serious violent delinquents? The answer was, as it always is, it depends. If these children are born into well-functioning families, their risk of becoming seriously violent delinquents was no greater than neurologically normal children. But if these neurologically impaired children were born into dysfunctional families, they were 4 times more likely to end up as violent delinquent teenagers. This is sort of a paradigm for understanding this. In this case, the toxic elements are inside the family. And of course, we all know that family influences are very important. But most of the focus has been on context beyond the family. And here it's important to understand what my mentor, Urie Bronfenbrenner, in his presentation of the ecology of human development, called macrosystems. These are the big social, cultural, institutional structures in which families and communities exist and develop. These are sort of the blueprints for society. Capitalism, communism, Catholicism, Islam, these major institutional, social, cultural, structural elements. But a very important part of understanding macrosystems from Bronfenbrenner's perspective was that they also exist in here, that is, they are embedded in the consciousness of individuals. So this is why, for example, in one study, the finding was the more authoritarian the political system in which 12-year-olds were growing up, the more adult-oriented their choices when faced with moral dilemmas. That the macro system of the democratic versus authoritarian system was embedded in the consciousness of children. I think it's a very powerful demonstration of macro system influences. But turning more directly to macrosystems and social toxicity as they affect the pathway to criminality, I think there are a series of exemplary, illustrative social toxins worth considering. And one of them is the Southern culture of honor. It's been understood that the Southern states have rates of homicide in excess of the Northern states. Because of cultural homogenization, this difference has diminished somewhat. Used to be bigger than it is now. Fox Butterfield, in his book All God Children, explored this and found that it had its origin in the disproportionate settlement of the Old South by Scots-Irish, who brought this culture of honor with them. It was then infused into the consciousness of the African population in the South, and this has become a historically significant phenomenon. It's one reason why murder rates among young African American males are typically 8 times higher than other groups, not because of their African heritage, but because of their Southern heritage. The kind of mentality that says if your honor is violated, if you're disrespected, this is such a threat you have to respond with violence. When coupled with racism, it becomes a very powerful engine driving aggressive, criminal, violent behavior. Second social toxin is the influence of media imagery. Research now tells us that the effect of TV violence on kids' aggressive behavior is at least as powerful as the effect of smoking on lung cancer. Both are significant factors. And if we understand this as a social toxin, then we can understand how differential exposure among children accounts for some of the differences in their aggressive behavior, which puts them on the fast track to delinquency, violence, and ultimately criminal prosecution. Another example is that the neighborhood in which people live has an effect on how their childhood development progresses. We know that if children develop a chronic pattern of aggression, bad behavior, acting out, and violating the rights of others by the time they're 10, that about 30% of them on average will end up as serious violent delinquents. But the point is, in some neighborhoods it's not 30%, but 15%. In other neighborhoods it's 60%. And the poisonous nature of those neighborhoods is that they combine high levels of social cohesion with high support for antisocial values. That combination takes the already vulnerable 10-year-old child who has a problem with aggression and antisocial behavior and magnifies and exacerbates it. The whole national system in which kids are growing up plays a role. After the Columbine school shooting, I was asked by an FBI agent, can you tell us something concrete and specific we could do to make our schools safer? And I said, yes, you jack them up, you put them on wheels, and you drive them to Canada. The youth homicide rate in Canada at that point was 1/10 what it was in the United States. These macrosystem issues of the society you're in play an important role in whether or not troubled, vulnerable kids will move into patterns of aggressive, violent criminality. Of course, racism, social inequality, and the illicit drug economy play a central role as well. Racism because it undermines the sense of well-being and introduces compensatory behavior. It's one reason why young African-American males are reported to have the highest rates of narcissism, because it's a compensation for the destructive influence of racism. Social inequality, economic inequality creates rage and shame at the bottom and entitlement at the top, and this is an engine to produce criminal behavior, particularly violent criminal behavior. As a boy once said to me after an interview, he said, Dr. G, when you were coming up, did you come up poor or regular? And I think that captures the issue we're talking about here, because the toxic influence of inequality is very powerful in producing rage and shame. Finally, I would point to the role of superficial consumer mass culture that defines success and identity in terms of material acquisition. One boy, after being given a life sentence, said he was going to kill himself. When asked why, he said, because I'm never going to the mall again. And I think in a graphic, stark way that captures this insidious and toxic influence. So when put all together, as these factors accumulate in the lives of vulnerable kids, they become a sort of pathway into criminality. And until we detoxify the social environment of kids, we will always face this pattern of vulnerability leading to criminality.